So let's explore the type of decorative arts that you might experience. There are a lot of art making types that fall into decorative arts, so I'm just going to show you the most prominent ones, but again, you can find others to look at as well. So we're going to start with ceramics and pottery, things made of clay. And, again, when thinking about what pottery is, it's a utilitarian object, but again, can also be a very beautiful object as well. I mentioned the Hopi woman already, and here you see more Hopi pottery. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what we call coil method and show you some photos related to that. But with clay, we talk about how it's plastic when wet, it can be shaped, and it's rigid when it's dry. Here you'll notice the coil method, which literally is like making little snakes of clay, right? And then building them up, right, into the actual vessel. This is the typical Hopi method that you would see used. But you may be more familiar with the throwing on the wheel method that you see here, where you're using, again, a potter's wheel to throw the piece. Now, how do you harden clay? Typically, most people use a kiln, and they use a firing method, right, to harden the clay to make it rigid, not plastic. And don't think I need to tell you that you obviously have to use a lot of safety precautions when working with a kiln in order to make pottery. And your finished products can be anything like the Hopi vases that you saw, or these are some Greek examples from the earlier archaic period of Greece, which would have been used for storing things like olive oil or wines. So think about how these are utilitarian objects. These are things that function in people's homes, but you'll notice they're still aesthetic and they still do something like tell you a story. On the left, for instance, you have Achilles and Ajax on this pot by Ezekias, and they're playing a little dice game. So this is a story from the Homeric epics. Or on the right, you have Euthymides' vase, and you have these, what we call the three revelers, these three guys kind of dancing and partying and drinking and hanging out. So even though these things were meant for storage, notice that aesthetics still come into play. Storytelling still comes into play. Glass making is another decorative art that you run into quite a bit. And obviously you're using silica, sand mixed with minerals that add color and melted down. And then again, hardened again, they become glass. And so here you'll notice this is a photo of a man doing glass blowing, where the silica has been melted, right, superheated, and being blown into different types of shapes in order to become the end product. Now, again, you can look at glass work all over the world, all different kinds of contexts. So I just picked out a few for you to look at. This is a rose window at Saint Denis in Paris, and rose windows were very popular in Gothic cathedrals, and they were called rose windows because they look like roses blossoming open. So this is where you might see glass used. It's inside a church, or you might see something like Art Deco, something early 20th century, like a Tiffany vase, a Tiffany lamp. Again, there's different ways you can see glass making used and created. Metalwork, of course, is a very typical decorative art. Again, just a few different examples from different parts of art history, one from Egypt, one from Aegean culture, where you can think about metalworking used for these funerary masks. Or, some non-Western examples, looking at some items found in early Peruvian culture. So you can think about the different ways that metals show up and are used. Or in Mesopotamian culture, to celebrate a great leader like Sargon, who's said to be the first leader of Mesopotamia. Fiber arts and textiles, and I listed for you just a few different ways that you might look at those fiber arts, things like weaving or embroidery, applique or quilting. These are things, I think people sometimes want to call them craft, because, you see a quilt in your grandma's house, let's say, and sometimes people don't stop and say, is that art or is that not art? But my argument would be, it is. It just may not be what you've thought of as art in the past. So again, just some thoughts about these techniques. How weaving is done, for instance. How is it created together? You should definitely look through those items in your text. And the kind of products they create, like the Islamic carpet on the left and the Islamic textile on the right. Islamic carpets, for instance, why is fiber art so important to Muslims? Well, they pray 5 times daily. You have to have a pretty nice prayer rug. It's a part of every Muslim's household holdings is to have a prayer rug. So I often talk about how culturally certain arts will be more important in certain cultures for different reasons. Another example I have for you here is the Bible quilt by Powers. And this is a way to look at applique, and also is a great way to look at folk art. So going back and thinking about the terms from your first chapter, because this is a self-taught artist. Applique is using sort of cutout shapes that are then stitched onto a backing element. So let's say the quilt had already existed. You would cut out little shapes like you see the little figures here, and you would then stitch them onto that background. And that's how applique is done.